Grace and peace be to you on this Ascension Sunday. Yesterday afternoon, I looked out over West Harbor and watched as two bright red kites were being flown over Dock Beach. At first, the one on the left was cautious, maintaining a mostly level and even placement in the sky. At that time, the one on the right experimented with swoops and dives, going far and wide. And then there was a shift. The person on the left tried out bringing the kite closer in, making smaller movements, dipping down toward the land. Meanwhile, the person holding the formerly swooping kite decided to let it go up higher and higher. It was joyful to see these kites darting and floating in the sky. I was intrigued to compare the changing approaches of these people guiding them. It takes skill to control a kite as the wind changes. I enjoyed watching their alternately bold, darting motions and their graceful movements up in the air. Imagine what it must have been like for the disciples as they stood with Jesus on the summit of Olivet, the Mount of Olives. At first, he spoke seriously with them, sharing hope and peace as he gave his final instructions. And then they realized that his feet were no longer touching the ground. He gradually went up into the sky until a cloud took him from their sight. How stunning. Maybe they recalled the story of the prophet Elijah, who left behind his protege Elisha when he ascended into heaven on the fiery chariot. Jesus did not need any assistance as he returned up to God in heaven. The gathered disciples gazed up, and then he was gone. Thankfully, the Lord sent two angels who looked like men. They explained Christ will return to earth in the same way that he departed from the sky. But in the meantime, they shouldn't keep standing there looking up. It was time for them to work together, to carry on with what the Lord had told them to do. Then the angels departed, and they knew it was up to them to figure out what would happen next. The 12 of them were gathered. As you know, it is so important to have just the right people on your team. In addition to assembling the right individuals, each person in the group should ideally be in the role that puts their gifts and skills to the highest and best use. I recently read a fascinating book, The Red Rose Crew, the true story of women, winning, and water by Daniel J. Boyne, with a foreword by sports historian David Halberstam. It's a dynamic account of the first American women's crew that competed in the 1975 World Championships. Their nickname, the Red Rose Crew, came from a sweet gesture on the day of their big race at Nottingham, England. A thoughtful person had tied a single red rose to the footplate for each of them in their place in the boat. Earlier that summer, they had gone to compete for their spot and were brought together from different colleges and rowing clubs around the country, from California, Wisconsin, Philadelphia, Princeton, New Haven, and Cambridge, Massachusetts. This is Carrie Graves, The Stroke. Well, their coach was a legendary guy named Harry Parker. He had coached undefeated men's crews at Harvard. And first, he had to determine who would be the 8 rowers, the coxswain, and the 2 spares. And then he had just a few weeks to decide on the best configuration for who should be in which seat or position in the boat. He took into consideration their strength, their technical skills, style, and personality, and how all of these qualities impacted the work that each needed to do. The 1970s was a challenging era in which to be a woman athlete. Even though Title IX had been passed in 1972, the practical implementation of it took time and called for a lot of courage from them individually. Well, by the end of the book, readers are thrilled to read how the American women's 8 managed to come in second place against seasoned women's professional teams from other countries. Several of the American women in that team were selected to compete in the 1976 Summer Olympics, the first to include a women's rowing event. Reading this book reminded me of lunchtime conversations with those who rowed crew when I was in high school. So getting your team to feel a sense of unity involves so much for a group that has a mission to accomplish. For the disciples too, Jesus, once he ascended into heaven, they thought to themselves, what should we do next? And they remembered back to their very beginning. The first thing Jesus did was assemble the 12 of them. And so they figured they should bring up their number to that number 12. They walked back from the top of the Mount of Olives to the place where they were staying in the upper room in Jerusalem. And at that gathering, Peter led them in what he felt strongly was the first item on the agenda. They had to discern through prayer who would be the new 12th disciple to take the place of Judas Iscariot, who had betrayed Jesus. They felt the main qualification was that it should be someone who had been a follower of Jesus from the beginning of his ministry in Galilee. And the deciding factor had to be that it was the one that God chose. So 2 men were proposed, Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was also known as Justus, and Matthias. Peter led them in prayer, asking God to make it clear who was the right one. And then they cast lots, as had been done a few times in the Old Testament. God directed that Matthias was the one selected. Jesus had told them to stay in Jerusalem until they received the gift from the Father, and they would receive power to become his disciples. They would be witnesses sent out to deliver and proclaim the wonderful message about Jesus the Messiah, the one God raised from the dead. Perhaps they were energized by that amazing experience of the risen Lord Jesus rising up before their eyes. God is described as the one who rides upon the clouds, the rider in the heavens, in Psalm 68. On that day, the disciples knew the risen Lord Jesus is God. It's amazing. But they must have been sad that he was no longer with them in person. For the past few weeks, we've been looking at the passages in the Gospel according to John that are called the farewell discourses. These were the teachings of Jesus to prepare his disciples before he departed. And today's passage represents a shift. Instead of talking to the disciples, the risen Christ speaks to God on their behalf, praying in front of them. He wanted them to know what was essential. This prayer has become known by biblical scholars as the high priestly prayer. In John chapter 17, verses 11 and 21, Jesus prayed that they all might be one. Unity is what Christ seeks for all of his followers. Jesus promised he would send his Spirit to fill and empower them. And we will celebrate this event next Sunday on Pentecost. But Jesus knew that it would be difficult for them to stick together without his leadership when he was no longer with them in person. Yet it was necessary that they not remain all together in a static version of what they had been like before, trying to maintain the status quo. Christ needed to ascend in order for them to get going in every direction, in order to spread the good news. As Jesus said, starting out where they were in Jerusalem and then going out to Judea, Samaria, and even to the ends of the earth. Sadly, the 12 did develop differences of opinion about theology and what to emphasize in their next steps, and they did have some breaking into factions. The various Christian denominations today reflect the separate strands of the Christian tradition. For example, the Eastern Orthodox Church maintains its own leadership in the countries and language groups that it oversees. The Roman Catholic Church has the Pope and its own hierarchy. Since the Reformation, a number of branches have developed in the Reformed tradition, of which our United Church of Christ is part. The Anglican tradition has its own history, with the Methodist strand as a renewal group that branched out from it. And there are also Anabaptist strands of the church, as well as Pentecostals and many other forms of Christian churches and gatherings of modern-day disciples in evangelical and non-denominational groups all around the world. When I was in my final year of the Master of Divinity program at Princeton Seminary, there was an essay contest sponsored by the Office of Ecumenical Relations of the Presbyterian Church USA. The task was to write about the ecumenical imperative of the church. I was drawn to this since I had grown up believing in the ecumenical movement. I had fond memories of singing, "And they'll know we are Christians by our love." Right? In a neighborhood midweek ecumenical ministry that my friends and I were part of. So 25 years ago, I wrote in my essay about the biblical basis, the historic creeds and statements by John Calvin, and how all of this imperative relates to us today for unity in our contemporary church context. I was delighted to win first prize, which provided me with a scholarship to attend a 2-week seminar at the Ecumenical Institute of Basel, Switzerland, a ministry of the World Council of Churches affiliated with the University of Geneva. So I participated in a seminar on the mission of the church in the 21st century. It was wonderful to meet all the people who were gathered as teachers and participants in this group. We worshiped together, singing songs in other languages with all kinds of different hymns and praise music from so many countries. We studied, we made presentations based on our research, we engaged in dialogue and shared table fellowship, and we realized what we had in common. There were about 20 of us from the Americas, as well as various African countries, Central and Eastern Europe and Asia. There was a Romanian Orthodox nun who painted an icon during prayer. She had a whole ritual of fasting to prepare herself for this writing of an icon, which is what it's called when you paint one. Amazing. There was a Korean Presbyterian woman pastor who joined us. There was a man who was a priest in Belarus, and I thought of him and his ministry when we first heard about Russia's war against Ukraine. There was a priest from France, and several of us toured the church and ate lunch with a family of a pastor friend of ours who lived and ministered in Interlaken, Switzerland. And a friend of mine that I met through this program, Marianne, from the church in Sweden, is now the communication director for the World Council of Churches. And the director of the Ecumenical Institute at Basel, Father Dr. Aaron Sauka, served in a major leadership role in the World Council of Churches, and he's just retiring this year. You may know that Christians in the Southern Hemisphere are celebrating today the start of the week of prayer for Christian unity. It's from May 21st through the 28th, and the theme for this year comes from Isaiah chapter 1, verse 17. Do good, seek justice. We can participate in this beautiful prayer week for unity as we lift up our prayers in our own time of quiet with the Lord this week. As we think about the church's ministry in unity closer to home,